So one of the most savage torture methods ever used in history has to be this bad boy here, the Judas Cradle, a device used by the Spanish Inquisition, and it doesn't take a genius to work out where the best place for that point is, so viewer discretion advised for this one. The wooden or metallic pyramid would have the victim placed on top of it and slowly lowered down using ropes, causing extreme pain in their lower orifices. The victim's hands and feet would be tied together to prevent them from moving around the point to get some relief, and if the torturer wanted to spice things up, he could add weights to the victim to speed up impalement, or oil onto the pyramid to make penetration a lot easier. The torturer could vary the pressure on the victim from a little bit all the way up until full body weight, and the torture could last for a few hours all the way to a few days. If the victim was refusing to speak, the torturer could shake them around on the point to vary its location in your lower region, and they could raise them and lower them repeatedly for maximum penetrations and maximum pain. The victim also wouldn't usually bleed too much, as the pyramid plugged the wounds until they were removed, if they hadn't already died from impalement. If you were lucky enough to get removed from this device, it is likely that you struggle to walk ever again, or die from infection to the rips from your muscle tissue, as the pyramid was never cleaned of its lovely juices from its previous occupants. Another such variation of the Judas Cradle is this bad boy here, the wooden horse, designed to inflict immense amounts of pain and also usually crippled you for life. So one of the most horrific execution methods ever conceived has to of course be scaphism, so extremely strong viewer discretion advised here as it gets pretty savage in some places. Also known as the boats, it was supposedly used by the Persian Empire starting around 500 BC, where two hollowed out logs, or two boats, would be nailed together with the victim placed inside. Their limbs and heads would be exposed though, and they would be force-fed a mixture of honey and milk, causing extremely horrendous diarrhea to fill the inside of their device. Flies and maggots would grow on the inside and slowly devour the victim alive, as well as the honey and milk mixture being placed on their face to attract flies and make it blister in the sun. Despite it being probably one of the most horrendous execution methods ever devised, there is no definitive proof that it was ever used. The first and one of the only mentions of scaphism that we have comes in around the 1st century AD from philosopher Plutarch. In his tale, a soldier named Mithridates kills Cyrus, the younger brother of King Archidaicus II, as apparently Cyrus was about to overthrow him. The king was of course grateful for Mithridates for putting a stop to this, but he insisted on keeping the tale a secret and instead saying that he slew Cyrus instead. One night though, Mithridates got a bit too drunk and started boasting how he had actually slew Cyrus instead of the king, and when the king heard about this, he wasn't too happy and sentenced him to an extremely slow, agonising and painful death with scaphism. During scaphism, the victim would still be fed the honey and milk mixture so he wouldn't pass away from dehydration or hunger, and apparently it took 17 whole agonising days for Mithridates to meet his end. Plutarch's account though is believed by some to be heavily fabricated, as he was writing a few hundred years after the event and he notably disliked the Persians, so it's unsure whether they actually used scaphism as a method of execution. Even so, it's either a method from the savage imagination of one deranged individual, or some unfortunate chaps actually had to endure this. And if you want to see this picture without the monkeys, just Google scaphism, because it's absolutely disgusting. So one of the most savage execution methods ever employed has to be execution by elephant, a punishment method used in the southern regions of Asia, so a bit of viewer discretion advised for this one. Elephants are extremely intelligent animals and can be trained pretty easily, so leaders use this to their advantage to get rid of people in some quite gruesome ways. Most simple way was just having the elephant crush your head like a melon, as the human skull can't really withstand around 5 tons of pressure. However, they also came up with some creative ways to prolong your suffering. The elephant could first crush all your limbs, inflicting immense pain on you before putting out your misery, as well as having sharp blades fitted to their tusks to slice you open before stabbing you and rearranging your internal organs, and some were even trained to throw you up in the air before catching you again and crushing you to death. The elephant would be controlled by a driver at all times called the mahout, which allowed them to spice up the execution by speeding up or slowing the pace of their agonising death, and it also allowed rulers to give a last-minute reprieve to some victims, displaying their merciful qualities. The usual victims would be enemies captured during battle, as well as criminals who committed theft and treason, and the execution signalled the ruler's ability to control the wild world, as well as having power over the life and death of his subjects. Elephants were also used in trial by ordeal, where a prisoner would face them in one-to-one combat, and if they beat them, they would gain their freedom, with the execution method lasting well up until the late 19th century. So in the world of the torturer, they had quite a few instruments available to them to make their victims talk. So let's take a look at some of the smaller utensils they used for the process, so a bit of viewer discretion advised for this one. Now, getting your limbs crushed could be quite a painful day out, so torturers used to warm you up to the occasion with this bad boy, the thumb screw. A self-explanatory device where your thumbs are placed between two metal plates before slowly more pressure is applied, turning your fingers or thumbs into complete mush, and sometimes even spikes were added between the plates to juice things up a bit. Now, this isn't your everyday BDSM collar, this is the Heretic's Fork, designed to make your life as miserable as possible if you are a heretic. When the device is attached, one fork goes into the underside of your chin, while the other one goes into your collar, forcing you to look at the ceiling for hours on end, and if you wanted to look down, the device would slowly impale your tongue in a quite painful process. Of course, it was designed so the prongs weren't long enough to kill your victim, as that would have been far too nice of escape for them. Pincers were another staple in the torturer's collection, which allowed them to alter the victim's body as they saw fit. By heating up the pincers, they could peel their victims like an onion, rip off chunks of flesh in one swift motion, or just stretch them out like a cheese string. Boiling wax or lead could then be applied to the victim's wound to let them know that you really fancy them. And finally, one for the gents, the crocodile shears, a device that would be heated up and attached to a certain body parts, scalding it immensely before it would be ripped off and chucked into the fire, burning it in front of you. So the rack was one of the most horrific torture devices in history, and even the sight of it was enough to break a victim's resolve. Originating in antiquity, the rack is most commonly associated with the Middle Ages, and it consists of a large rectangular wooden frame with rollers on either end where the victim's ankles and wrists would be attached to via ropes. Once your limbs are in place, they weren't going anywhere. The torturer would use a lever to tighten the ropes, stretching your limbs further and further apart, and your body would begin to break in a series of horrifying stages. Firstly, you'd experience a lovely popping sound as your limbs dislocated, and following that would be the sound of some beautiful cracking as your ligaments, cartilage and bones all snapped. Your muscle fibers would also be stretched so far that they couldn't contract anymore, making them ineffective. If your torturer was feeling particularly kinky when racking you, he could spice it up a bit by burning you with candles and torches, or even tear out your fingers and toenails, inflicting even more immense pain on you, assuming you can still feel your hands and feet at this point. The torture on the rack was administered in small sessions of 10 to 15 minutes, meaning the torture could last indefinitely, and if you were lucky enough to get off the rack, you would be crippled for life. So back in the day, the ancient Greeks created the ultimate life hack to keep you warm on those cold winter days. This beauty here is the Brazen Bull, a fantastic torture device that burnt people alive and created quite the spectacle for onlookers, so a bit of discretion advised for this one. The bull was made entirely of bronze and was hollow, and it had an entry door on one of the sides. The victim would be placed inside with a fire lit beneath the bull, slowly cooking the person alive, but the fun doesn't just stop there. It was fixed with pipes and whistles, so while the person on the inside was screaming their lungs out, outside it sounded like the snorts and growls of an angry bull. The story of the creation of this heating device is also quite sinister. In around the middle of the 6th century BC, a tyrant named Phalaris ruled what is now modern day Sicily. One day a man named Perillus showed off his new creation to Phalaris in an attempt to gain favour with him. Supposedly, Perillus told the tyrant, "His screams will come to you through the pipes as the tenderest, most pathetic and most melodious of bellowings." And of course he thought he'd receive a fantastic reward for such an invention. However, Phalaris had no time for people fawning over him and chucked Perillus in himself, so the creator would become its first victim. Before he could roast alive, Perillus was removed from the bull and chucked over a cliff edge, ending it all for him. Of course, when Phalaris was overthrown only a few years later, he did suffer a majestic end to this beauty. The story of its creation does have a few variations, but it seems like the perfect gift to give someone at Christmas if you don't like them.